but plug economics. I have some very, very bright people who are desperately looking for people who are interested in economics to actually understand what's going on. And there's all kinds of books and resources they've got, and they're looking for people to actually kind of ground roots apply these ideas. So if you're interested, I can.
She'd like to see you.
Oh, hi, mate. Come here. This is Meg. So a couple of things. Ethics, I think, only makes sense if you actually are starting from an actual understanding of a situation. Strong feelings are a starting point, but they're not sufficient for working out the nature of problems. But at least in terms of economic involvement, I think there are three different levels that might be helpful to, in terms of thinking about the way that people are involved in various economic cycles and structures and reciprocal relationships and what have you. And the first one, of course, is basic self-interest. People usually do things because they want to get some benefit. And most of the time, as long as people are on their best behavior, that works. But not always. And eventually, we realize that for our economic well-being, that is, getting the basic stuff to feed us and to shelter us and to give us our basic needs on a regular basis, we require some kind of social order. And so you've got a second level. And usually people can recognize that your best interests are often served by being part of the social order, because you don't want to eat today, you want to eat every day. You don't want a place to live today, you want a place to live all the time. You want regular services. So it's not too difficult to kind of recognize that the social order is a necessary element. The problem comes, I think, when we assume that the social orders are, how should I put this, intrinsically good. There's a larger perspective, and that's kind of the historical perspective. And because everything that we do as human beings is always in flux, it's changing. Things are either getting better or they're getting worse. So you have to take a larger perspective into account, and that's the level where people get critical. And usually you get critical because you start to realize or recognize disparities, differences between what's being promised and what's actually happening. But, and it's a big but, at that level, I think that's when people have to start engaging in kind of critical studies to figure out what's wrong with the system, what's wrong with the institutions. And we don't, as a rule, encourage that kind of thinking. We don't encourage it in education, because education is also a conservative institution. And all institutions usually have as their primary reason for existing their own continuation. So you're usually not getting a whole lot of critical thinking in the institutions themselves. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of the tricky bit. How do you institute a recognition that there is a required level of order, and yet have the people participating in that order reflecting critically on it so that you can adjust to new conditions, to new situations, and to mistakes. For example, when you finally start realizing, I hope, that the economic system that we have right now doesn't work, and giving people money to solve the problem, who created the problem in the first place, without getting them to actually tell you what they're going to do differently than what they did in the first place, I think would have been a logical first step, but I don't think anyone actually took that. So I'm, you know, I don't know. Basically, I think the critical capacity comes when people are in the midst of crisis. Obviously, if the economic system is not working for you, you're aware that there's a crisis. Traditionally, our economic system is based on the fact that there's a discrepancy between what people do and the amount of benefits they get. I don't think that has to be an essential part of a functional economic cycle, and yet this seems to be fairly much taken for granted in most of the circles that I hear people talking about this. The capitalist system is essentially the best system, it's the freest system, and that it's the fairest system because the benefits flow to people according to their, well, I'm not sure what. I don't get that part, but and I'm increasingly surprised by the fact that the system doesn't work, doesn't seem to be generating any kind of critical responses from the people who are supposed to understand how it works in the first place. Which takes me back to the economic stuff, and I think that in order to do the ethics correctly, you actually have to understand what happens in ethics and, you know, or in economics, how economic cycles work, what the important variables are, and why people participate in this economic habits. I'm not sure how I can do this without getting more technical. I have a friend at Memorial who wrote a little story to kind of illustrate this. He talks about going to his grandmother's in Carsdale in Nova Scotia, just at the foot of the North Mountain. And his grandfather was a retired pastor, and they grew vegetables in their garden, and they collected fish from the fish weir. And they collected fish in the fish weir because you can get more fish from a weir than just fishing in the line. But it's too much work. It's too much work for one family to operate a fish weir. So once or twice a season, all the people in the community would come together and help his grandparents fix the weir so that they could go collect the fish twice a day when the tide went out, and then they could smoke the fish and trade the fish and what have you. There was another family down the road that Mike's family knew, the Porters, and the Porters had milk cows. But occasionally they had problems, like one season their barn burned down. So everybody in the community got together and helped them build the barn, because everyone realized that it was in their best interest for these people, the Porters, to continue having milk cows, because everyone in the community would then get milk. So there are individual skills and there are individual projects, but in order to keep the infrastructure going, people have to participate. And it's not just because they're going to get an immediate an immediate benefit from helping, but because they recognize in the long term, when Mike's family's got fish, everyone in the village will have fish. When the Porters have milk cows, everyone in the village will have milk and butter. And occasionally, you have to add a little extra labor to keep the infrastructure functioning. So people participate because they recognize, in a small community it's easier to recognize, but it's easier to tell that it's in your best interest to have your neighbors producing the food you need rather than to have to go like 20 miles down the road to get the same kind of products. Now, in a certain sense, in a healthy economy, you're going to have that kind of structure based on all kinds of communities, like a community the size of Fredericton. I remember my dad used to tell me in Ontario and Quebec that before they centralized all the big power stations, all the little communities used to generate their own electricity. It provided employment for local people. You used local resources. Most of the time they were water mills. There were usually already water mill structures from woolen mills or grist mills in the neighborhood. So it wasn't as if there was any major requirement of massive infrastructure. And yet the system seemed to work perfectly well. Once you centralize everything, you may be able to make a claim that there's a certain amount of efficiency that you're benefiting from, but the economic costs are not merely, I think, or shouldn't only be judged in terms of efficiency. I think, for example, instrumental thinking is somewhat problematic, and it certainly doesn't lend itself to any real long-term ethical project. And that's primarily because ethics is about relationships between human beings. There is no ethics out there. There is no independent ethical structure that you can add to an economic theory. Ethics are about the actual relationships that people have between each other that enable us to live together more or less successfully. So it's not an additional thing to all the other things we're doing. It's foundational and it's primary. And the best way, I think, to recognize it is to recognize that even though we all have individual needs and desires, we're usually getting those needs and desires met because we're already participating in social relationships. And it seems to me that any economic theory that is going to have a fundamental ethical element is going to have to somehow recreate that basic dynamic. So I don't want to do the math. I'm not good in the math. I think essentially that's how it works. You know, and all the ideas about social justice and all of those useful ideas, I think they should be considered not as additional elements of economics, but they should be fundamental to the very idea of economics, because economics essentially is just about how people go about making a living. And if you remove people from the equation, whatever your ethics is about, or whatever your economics is about, it's not going to be ethical. It can't be ethical. So I apologize because it's oversimplified, but
that's great. Comments? Well, it's certainly interesting to think about ethics in the context of economics, because so many decisions that are made made on the basis of economic assumptions, and some of those economic assumptions are, rational choice. So the rational economic actor is the one who is pursuing or trying to pursue a maximization of their own individual interests. And we have kind of an economic system that's set up like that. So I guess, how would we conceive of an alternative economics that would kind of capture some of the things that Michael's talking about?
Well, I have a response to that. Actually, the problem precisely is that people start with theories about what people are that are just fundamentally wrong. The basic idea is in fact that humans are fundamentally motivated by self-interest, and that's the lowest common denominator. And this, all of our history of social philosophy and economic theory suggests that's the case. In fact, the reality is quite different. If that was true, none of us would have lived through childhood, because our mothers would have either sold us or gone out and got jobs instead of feeding us. And the fundamental human reality is that human beings are essentially looking out for each other. That's what human beings are fundamentally about. They're doing some interesting studies now in terms of cognitional development with very small babies before they've developed language. And the test essentially is showing puppets, just very small babies, puppets that are playing nicely together, and puppets that are fighting with each other. And then they let the babies choose the puppets they want to play with. In every case, the babies choose the puppets that play nicely together. In every case. No exceptions. This is before children have language skills. People are inclined always fundamentally to cooperate with each other. And yet our fundamental assumptions about what we all have in common would have us be seen as inherently in conflict all the time. So if your fundamental starting point is wrong, your economics is going to be screwed up for sure. I mean, that seems to be inevitable, and we're living out the consequences of it now. But once people start believing those things, we actually turn them into self-fulfilling prophecies. If you are taught that everybody's essentially greedy, and if you're not greedy too, you're going to miss out on your share, then you're going to participate in the world now. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not fundamentally what humans are about.
That's really interesting too, right? Because one of the things that ends up happening is you have people in institutions like banks that are trying to maximize the bottom line, trying to increase profit without thinking about what the human consequences are of some of the deals that they're making.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're very right to say that, like, basically, depending on the circumstance that we're in, depending on the institutions that we're embedded in, we end up having like these ethical stances that are perhaps not ethical stances at all. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think it's done without thinking?
Yeah.
I think you're being kind.
Okay, well then your ball.
I don't think it's done without thinking. I think people know exactly what they're doing. I think they know the effects of what they're doing. I think it's more important to them to make money.
I can't hear what you're saying.
It's okay, you listen to me regularly.
She said
heard it all before.
She thinks that people they know exactly what they're doing. They know that they're instituting policies, economic and political policies that do have an impact. great impact on people.
In the States, they know exactly,
Yeah.
politicians know exactly where they can put the line, where people are going to start going, no! And they push it right down to that line.
Sure. But what's
And
that
over.
what's that got to do with
That's why you're
ethics?
here.
Like, I don't think that's got anything to do with ethics.
Well, the ethical stance that people are taking, right? In this case, they're taking a self-interested ethical stance in certain capitalist institutions like banks, right?
Right.
You know, that's a product of the institution. The institution, in a sense, makes people or rewards people for acting in a particular way. Yeah, that's all I was saying.
Well, I assume then that at a certain point people have to step back and ask themselves whether what they're doing makes any sense at all. My basic example is one that kind of struck me at a very early age. I wanted, I don't know, it was a Johnny 7. I was like about 7 years. It was a big plastic gun, and it had bombs and whistles and all kinds of plastic things. And I wanted this gun. I was, advertised on TV, and that's all I wanted for Christmas. And usually at my house we got socks, so I didn't think I really had a big chance at this. But for 2 months, it was just, if I had that big plastic gun, my life would be perfect. And so Christmas comes, I run out there, big box, open the box. My life was perfect for about a day and a half. And then it was back to life again. I mean, there's a certain kind of discrepancy. If consuming things was as wonderful as it purports to be, we'd all be happy campers. We'd all live in the beer commercial, right? But it's not. I mean, the reality and what's being promised or projected, there's a huge discrepancy, and we all realize that. We all recognize that. And it seems to me that you can justify banks can justify doing nasty things to make huge profits, but you can only justify it by really ignoring the evidence, and that's got nothing to do with ethics. Ethics is not divorced from understanding real life, what's going on, and so if you're deliberately choosing not to understand or to figure out the implications of what you're doing and why you're doing it, then whatever you're doing, it's not ethical. It might be something else. It might be damage control or crisis management or something. You can call it all kinds of fancy things, but it's not ethics. Ethics is about trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And you have to understand what's going on in order to do that.
I think we already, something really important, just coming from my point of view, is kind of a philosophical one, like talking about that. And I think 85% of the people in our society think this way too, of like this whole Hobbesian philosophy of who human beings really are, that we're radically separate from each other and self-interested. And even though we have, holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving, which let us pretend that we don't actually feel that way. But it's like, and I think that the idea of economy has a lot to do with it too, because if we look at what we really mean by economy, even though a lot of us today, when we say we need money, I think if you push it a little further, it will actually lead to what human beings are on a more basic level, which is, a system of giving and taking between people. And if you want an ethics of economy, I think that you really have to look, because we can get caught up in using the word economy without really knowing what it actually means and just what we think it means.
Sure.
I think it's an actual system of, human beings, like an exchange between us. It's like, and is our ethics of economics allowing for that to happen, or is it causing us to be more separate? And what are the things that we can do to be more in sync with who we are on the most basic economical level.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, I completely agree.
it's that idea of us just blindly thinking we know who we are as human.
And fundamentally, as you point out, the basic relationship in economics is one of trust. You have to trust people to do business with you. So if people screw you over, they're not going to be in business for a long time. And somehow we've figured that we've got a system now where the people running the system assume that if they can take off the top and not get caught, then they're meeting their personal needs and appearing to meet the social needs. But, you know, I think anytime you have something as complex as economic relationships, it's always possible for people to abuse them. It's always possible to abuse them.
How do you take the kind of sense of community that you can get in a small group like this, where people do, I think, even today, cooperate fairly well and do a bit of all for one and one for all, and spread that out into something the size of a country, where you're dealing with people that are 1,000 miles away, and you don't quite have the sort of personal connection, and it's easier to ignore somebody's needs and pain if they're in Vancouver than if they're sitting across from you in this circle.
Yeah. I don't know, but I know that there are people in different parts of the country, in Canada historically, who've created alternative economic systems for their part of the country, like the old Cody movement in Nova Scotia. It started the co-ops, the cooperative movements, and in farming and in what do you call it? What's the Caisse Populaire? Credit unions. The CCF out in the prairies, who started folk farmers cooperatives because they were being screwed by the banks. There are historical examples of people in communities recognizing that they have common needs, and because of that coming together. But in my limited experience, people usually don't willingly come together until the crisis is right in their face, as a rule. And it would seem that in terms of making a movement, like expanding a movement from a local base to a national base, it still has to be grounded in local communities always. I think personally, that's where the strength is coming from. That these are events that are happening all over the world, but they're very specific to particular communities, right? And every community's got kind of a different take on what's at stake, and there's different relationships. There is a common goal. There's a common recognition that the current situation is just untenable. But how the Occupy movement is going to evolve, I guess that remains to be seen. It certainly has to do with levels of commitment, I think, and that ties into ethics. I mean, if for what it's worth, people only do things when they're deeply committed to them. Because otherwise, when they get difficult, you go home. You change your mind, or you do something else. So I guess it depends on how seriously people take the problems that they recognize, and how willing they are to actually make a difference with their own persons. But as for organizing it, I think you need people with organizational skills. I personally, I don't know how to do that. What do you think?
Well, that's a big question.
I agree with you that it's we need a system of commonality between people in order to create that kind of network. If you don't have anything in common with another person in Vancouver, then chances are you're not going to be willing to connect with them. Then again, like this is exactly what you're saying with the Occupy movements, how it's the same thing everywhere. So if you take that in an economic system, everyone wants the same thing everywhere, then it's very likely that people everywhere will start to work together to achieve that goal. And this is made even easier these days with the internet. I mean, if we were talking 100 years ago and we had a system, if we had commonalities between people thousands of kilometers away, I mean, yeah, we could probably work together, but I mean, the movement time or the speed of this would be delayed by months or sometimes years if someone gets wintered in and the messages can't flow. But now that we have internet, I mean, we can access each other immediately. So I think it's commonality and use of new technology that we can really push that point.
Like you say too, that it starts with our own persons too, and that's where a more rigorous analysis of things like ethics and economics comes in too, is because maybe me and someone in Vancouver, everyone is different. There's different personalities, there's different personalities, there's a different culture. But if you more critically analyze, the reason that these systems have sprung up, the reason why we need economic and ethical systems, then we'll be able to more see, what it is that connects us as human beings, and, rather than, just having it handed to us on a silver platter when it is that we're supposed to care about it. It does start with each person, because I don't think that any kind of social change can ever be separated from individual change.
Definitely it can.
They say change starts local. I think it goes a lot more local than people actually realize.
I mean, even the person themselves.
Like there's the economic system going on. Each one of us have.
Well, it's funny what you're saying here. It's almost the stories that...
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm just thinking it's what you're saying with the stories that we've been told since we were kids about how the world works and what people are really like, and that sort of going around and around and becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. What has to happen for people to be able to see through those? Obviously, education plays a large role in both reinforcing the stories and maybe dispelling them. We hope. But then what about starting to tell sort of new stories about how things could be? And I mean, they're out there, but they seem to be floating around out there rather than being taught as something concrete, as concrete as you may learn in a business school, for example.
Well, yeah, I guess for me, part of the problem is because we're human beings, we're all creatures of habit. So we're familiar with the habits we're familiar with. And Freud used to say that people will go to extraordinary lengths to hold on to their illusions. So I think we spend a whole lot of energy in misguided fashion, probably. I guess that I do believe that any substantial change comes from people taking their own lives seriously enough to try and figure them out, really. And I mean, something like ethics has no real significance unless someone actually chooses to make that a significant part of what they're trying to work out, which is essentially figuring out what's going on and what's the best thing for them to do. I don't think there's shortcuts. You know, I really don't think there are quick solutions, and changing one set of formula for another, you know. I mean, you see this, you know, because I teach in religious studies, you get this with religion. People argue about formulas without really understanding what the formula is about or what they signify. You know, I'm thinking about, what's the story, Gulliver's Travel, and the war between the people who open their eggs at the big end and the people who open their eggs at the small ends, and they go to war and destroy them because they're heretics. And I like the hokey pokey. I'd say the right foot hokey pokey who are normal people, and all those crazy hokey pokey who put their left foot in first. And we can't, you know, get rid of those people because they're crazy. We get hung up on the formulas without actually taking the reality of our lives seriously, I think. And I think we're encouraged to do that as well. Makes us better consumers.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying with consuming both in an economic level, but also these patterns that occur at a personal level. But you only have to do something so many times, and it hurts you. Every time you do it, it hurts you. And every time you do it, how many times do you do it before you realize this has got to change? And it happens at a personal level, but it also, you see it happening sort of now at a much larger level. People are going, okay, this is not working. It's like you're just starting to see through it.
Yeah. Well, the only difference between relatively intelligent people and stupid people is that relatively intelligent people learn from their mistakes. Stupid people keep making the same mistakes over and over again. That's, I think, the only difference, really. Everyone makes mistakes. But if you're paying attention, then you can catch it quicker. When you get it wrong, you can try something different. Yeah.
There's almost a sense of a bottoming out, possibly, that I hear people saying sometimes. It's that it has to.
Matthew, stop whispering.
What's that?
The whispering.
I'm sorry. It must be just this. Yeah. No, I'm just. There's this sense. There's this sense of like, you know, there's a bottom that it has to be hit. You know, I mean, the major social reforms never really came through, say, till the Great Depression, and people were off. Like, even then, people ignored it for a long period of time before they said, okay, we obviously, even very, very well-to-do rich people said, yeah, no, this has got to change. And you know, I'm worried and also expectant of some sort of bottom. And I wonder what you think about that.
I try not to. I try not to anticipate everything having to fall apart before people take the problem seriously. I fight against that. I would like to think that most people are more reasonable than that. But what it takes to get people to act collectively, I have no idea.
Seems like a certain amount of hardship needs to be there. I don't know.
Well, you know, according to Stats Canada, the people who are the most generous in terms of donating to people in need are Maritimers. And economically, the Maritimes are considered the worst off part of Canada. So maybe something like that. Maybe.
It's an interesting correlation.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
That, maybe we're thinking down on that more fundamental level that you were talking about, where ethics is all about good relationships between people. That we really do strive for goodness and not for everything else that we've been taught or propagated with over the years.
Yeah. Well, if my Christmas, you can get all the big plastic guns you want, it's not going to make your life great.
It's funny, there seem to be two kind of economic systems at work. One's one of expenditure and one is one of collecting. You talked about Freud. Freud was obsessed with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that, life, an economic system is all about what are we doing it for the sake of? Are we doing it for the sake of collecting, or are we doing it for the sake of expending? And, to be a human being, according to a lot of political philosophers, is the idea that as humans, we are here to collect, yes, but only to expend. The work that we do is for the sake of being able to expend that, but we seem to be operating on a level that's like preserving our life for as long as we can and collecting as many things as we can, rather than for the sake of actually living our lives with each other. You kind of choose one that you operate on.
Yeah. But the one doesn't make sense. I mean, it just doesn't work. I don't think people with money are happier. I really don't. I don't think their lives are essentially better. They may not have the same concerns that other people have, but I'd say that the amount of meaningful relationships that they have is probably negligible.
Because it's like to operate on that level, you need to say no to a certain aspect of what it means to be a human being.
Yeah. You have to do violence to yourself, which is never a good idea.
And that comes back to what you said about Freud, like people fighting for those illusions that they've been given as they grow. You brought up being a child, and how they always go for the dolls that are the puppets that are being friendly and loving. That's because you're most authentic when you're a child. You haven't been filled with knowledge yet. That knowledge corrupts the shit out of you.
Yeah. We need more toilets.
Yes.
And that relates a lot to the Occupy movement too, because a lot of people's problem with the Occupy movement is that it kind of eludes the type of reasoning they're trying to apply to it. Like, what's the purpose of you guys being here? And it really goes well towards people fighting for these illusions, because if we were to use reason to try to reason people out, you can't reason someone out of something they were never reasoned into. So to have a movement that eludes the whole kind of logic they're trying to apply to it, I think is kind of one that's really effective. And what would seem like a weakness of the movement, I think, is actually one of its biggest strengths. So you can't really pinpoint with that type of rationale what it is you're trying to do.
Well, the Occupy movement is a form of direct democracy, which is more effective than representation.
But if we think of the Occupy movement, and I think a lot of us do, right? We want to think of the Occupy movement as something that is going to produce some changes. Right? So one of the things that we've already done is we've changed the conversation, which is no small feat. But getting back to what Matt was saying earlier, right? In response to the current crisis that we're in, things are going to change, right? We need to have, a good understanding of what this thing's about and what we want to do. And I think that forums like this, but also general assemblies, we haven't had one here in a while. We need to have those and do the hard work of putting forward some ideas for changing things. That doesn't have to be like our one demand or our 10-point program or whatever, but it needs to address some of the things that need to be changed. When Matt was talking, I was thinking about, in the 1930s, people decided that they wanted to change things, but their analysis of what the problem was unemployment. Right? So we got a post-war system that dealt with the problem of unemployment for 30 years, and after that, it fell apart. I think that we have to bear in mind what that was about and be more ambitious this time, right? What's the problem about, right? And how are we going to go about fixing it? For what it's worth, right? Maybe the problem isn't the 99 versus the 1%. Maybe it's about a system that generates a 99 versus a 1%.
How sweeping of a change do we dare to propose at this point? I mean, if I went out there and started propagating what I think the ultimate solution is, I'm not going to carry too much of the Canadian population with me in that, because they're not ready to hear it yet. I mean, so how far do we dare to go?
We're not an electoral party, so we don't have to pander. We need to be asking questions and getting people to try to take those questions up. And some of the ones actually that Michael is talking about are quite interesting, right? So, does having more money make us happier, right? Does trying to maximize our own individual desires or satisfactions or what have you, does that make us happier? Or do other things make us happier? And more directly on kind of policy issues, right? Why not push the envelope? Why not say, do we have a future in a capitalist system, right? Does it make sense to continue doing this, right? Maybe it doesn't. I think that there are some serious both financial and environmental limitations to keeping this thing going.
Okay, saying the capitalist system doesn't make sense, that's kind of a negative proposal in a way. I mean, it would be even, I agree, but it would be even better if we could say, instead of capitalism, this, and have something fairly concrete, because we haven't put that out at all, and that's kind of one of the criticisms we get.
I have a model for you. Bernard Lonergan came up with an economic model, and his basic assumption, which I think is fundamentally correct, is that, well, in order to fix a situation, you have to understand what's at stake in the first place. So before you can actually work out how to fix an economy, you got to actually understand what an economy is. And once you get that clear, at least you can figure out, you then have the wherewithal to figure out what's working and what's not working. And then you can start systematically addressing the issues that, this is not working, and because of that, lots of people's lives are pretty miserable. Okay, well, why isn't it working? But just feeling strongly about problems, as you say, it's not a sufficient response. But there are economic models that are actually premised on the fact that if you understand economics, what's actually going on, then you can actually adjust things and start figuring out, making your calculations on the basis of what's actually happening as opposed to what people assume is happening. And that's kind of a critical distinction. It's a critical distinction in just about anything. I mean, you can't fix anything unless you actually understand the nature of the problem. So, and an economic system is no different than anything else. It's more complex. But wanting things to be different is only the starting point, I think, of being able to figure out, okay, what's not working, why is it not working, and what would a system that is working look like?
What would it? I mean, do you have? That's pretty abstract. I mean,
yeah, it is. It is.
Have you?
Well,
have you got a plan yourself that you think is good, or?
I have. There are plans from people who've actually spent 30 or 40 years of their lives developing these things that I'm still actually trying to figure out myself. But for example, they distinguish economic variables invariant variables. For example, they make distinctions between a basic economic set of relationships that has to do with consumption, basic, food and goods that people require on a regular basis. Then they introduce the notion of a second economic cycle, which deals with creating the wherewithal, the means of production to maintain the first level of economic production. So you've got two levels of production. And according to the guy who came up with this theory, most economic problems and mistakes in calculations come because they take those two models and they conflate them. And they're different kinds of economic cycles. And then he introduces the notion of what a stable economic society is. And he talks about credit and he talks about money. But credit, for example, credit refers to people who have good ideas that, if implemented, will raise the general standard of living for everyone. And the economic system is kind of devised as a means of increasing the standard of living for everyone, where the outcome is a stable society, and you only change the stability of the economic model when someone has a better idea, and then you introduce more credit, and then it takes a while for the implementation of the better idea, and everybody's standard of living increases. The basic goal of this larger model is to give people more free time, higher standard of living, more free time. So if you're introducing ideas that are more productive or more efficient, there's a social benefit for everyone. So everybody's standard of living goes up. Everyone has more time to be involved in communities, in community in more meaningful ways. I mean, the history of civilization is essentially trying to get not everyone having to work all the time just to survive, right? So in an economic system that's working, you want to maximize benefits for people, and you want to have people engaged in fundamental economic production at a minimal level, not at a maximum level, so that everybody's got a good lifestyle, but then also can be engaged in their community in more creative ways, and not just in making a living. But there are models. There are people who've got. I can show you a number of books and people who.
Sure.
Sorry.
You should go first.
Yeah. I agree completely. We do need much better ideas to invest our time with. But I also think that one of the fundamental problems of our modern day economic system is that it's just basically the problem of what shareholders mean to the economic system. Basically, corporations are made on the risk of shareholders. So shareholders put money into these corporations in the hope of getting return, and they want their money back plus profit as soon as possible. With this, basically the corporation is trying to make as much money as possible and cut corners and make lots of risks. And this is what often causes crashes, global crashes, recessions, and also for these corporations could easily go out of business by cutting these corners or doing something that they didn't look into very properly because they're trying to get the shareholders' money back as fast as possible. So on top of investing not only in these more sound ideas that are more sustainable and create better living for everyone, but you also need them to invest in long-term ideas. So basically, if they're all looking for their money back for the short term and causing all of these problems, then what you need to do is change the mentality and switch it to a long-term focus, so that they don't expect their money back for a long time, so that they're in it for the long. And then we have a much more stable economy that can create more jobs. It'll probably make better products. People will be more happy with the products. It'll probably employ more people at a better rate. And therefore these people can in turn buy the products that are being made. So it's a completely sustainable economy. And all you have to do is just change a mode of thinking from short-term profit to long-term profit.
I think
Yeah, I agree.
I think if we get down to the fundamental, sorry, am I talking over? No? Okay. I think if we get down to like the fundamental core of where our economy needs to start, it needs to start with a major problem we have of ownership in our society. In our current economic environment, might makes right, and it's been that way for a long time. It's only taken different shapes, and it has become more fair. There's more opportunity for those who don't necessarily have might to start off with to get that might, but might still makes right in our global economy. I mean, who gives BP the right to go down into the Gulf of Mexico and put a big giant hole in the bottom of the ocean floor and pollute our oceans, you know, and get that oil and then sell it to all of us and make money off of it, you know? So we need, that is probably one of our core fundamental problems with our economy, is how we view ownership. You know, everybody thinks that things belong to them, but really they're just temporarily in your possession. You know, your house, your clothes, even your body. Your consciousness temporarily possesses your body, and eventually your body's gone. Whether your consciousness goes or not, that's a whole nother story. You know, so I think if we can try to get people to start changing how they think about ethics and about how we relate to each other and how we relate to the actual environment that we're in, and all the resources and opportunities that we have available to use. Start there. You know, spread the word.
Something that everybody's doing is really good to talk about these larger economic solutions, and I find it. I mean, I find it all very complex and much beyond my scope of things. But when you consider some more collectivist thinking, you know, at a very local grassroots level, and I hesitate to use that word, but I mean like communities and small communities deciding that, okay, we're gonna build a house out, or build in whatever way out in the country, and instead live there as a community. I mean, there are examples of this in a lot of places all over the world. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the solution, but I'm saying that there are simple ways of getting our needs met. And I think when times get tough, that we go to those things. And Occupy, I really see that sometimes, is when people go, okay, some of these people really don't have homes, and they're going there saying, okay, there's a community here, and I don't have a home, I don't have a place to be, so I'm going to go meet with people in this area, because that's a need, and there's some food there, and you know, there are people who are like-minded, and it's a very simple solution to some needs that people are having, regardless of what the grand economic solution is. It's just this, obviously there's something missing, or you know, people are going and having these conversations.
If we're talking about alternatives to the current system right now, I think we should ask ourselves whether it's possible to fix the current system we're in through reform, incremental reform, or whether we take something that's much more radical and kind of isolating the problems with our current system. Maybe the incentive-based system that we have now, which addresses personal gain and individual needs. Is that possible to change in our current system by reforming, or do we want to get to a system that is more along the lines of collectivist maybe values, like social needs, larger scale needs than individual ones. How do we get to that system? Is there any way to move forward or fix the current system we're in? And our current system has a very strong set of values right now that would be very difficult to change, and there'd be a lot of people very resistant to the current value system being changed. I think people realize that the values we have right now are part of the reason we're in this situation, or they legitimize some actions of people that have maybe larger amounts of capital or have greater influence over how our current system is run or the fate of it, or they are larger stakeholders in whether our system works for everyone or just for them. Those kind of things need to be considered. If we were to get to an alternative system, I think there would probably be a large sentiment here that we need to address social needs on a larger scale than individuals, and everyone would have to make large sacrifices for that based on the current value system we have right now. It's just a comment.
I think you're right. Now, God knows how it's going to come about.
Yeah. Do we have a better idea of where we want to go, or are we more concerned with just changing things as they are now, or are we trying to fix things as they are now?
Well, I think it comes back to your issue of power. I think power is different than ownership, but as long as we kind of understand power is linked to an individual initiative, there's always the potential for change. I guess I wonder how you talk to people with particular sets of vested interests and suggest that their interest would still be met and yet change the fundamental model that they think makes sense to them. Like how do you get people to do that? I think probably you have to show them that ultimately there's something fundamentally wrong with what they're doing in the first place, and that there are consequences. Now, whether they're going to respond to that is another question altogether, but it would seem to me that that's at least something you might try to do practically. That given these practices and these assumptions, here are the consequences. Now, by shifting a couple of things or changing how you understood your business, you could still maybe make money and yet avoid making all these other people's lives so miserable. I don't know, but that would at least be practical, I would assume.
Michael, I would just want to thank you for coming out here. I think we can continue the conversation informally for those who are interested in doing so. And for those who are also interested in doing so, I think we're going to do some yoga. So thanks very much, Michael, for coming out.
Thank you very much.
I just have something to say. A lot of you guys